In this section, we're going to discuss cognitive development. So, Piaget investigated how children's thinking changed through development. And through these studies, he proposed that people change how we think as we form new schemas, or in other words, ways that we think about how the world works. So, examples of this is the idea of assimilation. This is the process that we use to incorporate new information into existing frameworks for our knowledge. So let's use this example here of the idea that we have an idea that a bird is an animal that has a wing and it flies. And that becomes then the schema that a child is using, and so therefore that can lead to mistakes where it identifies in this case that a butterfly being an animal that has wings and can fly, that would mean that that butterfly is a bird. Accommodation is the process used to create new frameworks for knowledge or drastically alter existing ones to incorporate new information. So, um, if we update the schema that birds include new types of information that then would exclude what a butterfly is. So, birds are animals that have wings and they fly, but they also have beaks. And so this other animal, which has wings and also flies, but doesn't have a beak, that is now a new schema of these flying animals that so you can learn, okay, these are birds, this is not a bird. So we just go through this process of having these schemas that we update, that we use this accommodation to create new ways of learning or uh, forming cognitive thoughts. So Piaget saw cognitive development occurring in different stages. So let's talk about those stages. So the first one he saw was this motor stage. So this is birth to 2 years. And I should just go ahead and start off that these time frames are what he put forward for this. We'll talk a little later that the time frames aren't really uh, perfect in any way. So his first stage of the theory of cognitive development is that infants acquire information about the world through their senses and their motor skills, and they can learn to act with intention. So you think of many young baby toys that they can pull a string and the toy will move or it'll make a noise or something, or they can press a button. They start learning that if I do something, then something will happen. Um, One of the kind of hallmark tests of at this stage is object permanence, understanding that even if something's out of sight, that it will still exist. So this is probably why peekaboo is a fun thing for many babies that putting your hands in front of your face, if they don't understand object permanence, it's like that person disappears and then they instantly reappear. And same thing that, if you, when you hide a toy and then you have the toy come back, that it's like it disappeared and it really came back because they don't have that object permanence yet. Then we have the pre-operational stage, which Piaget said was around from 2 to 7 years of age. And so this was his second stage. This is where children learn to use language and to represent objects by images and words. Children can think symbolically about objects, but their reason is often based on intuition and superficial appearances rather than with a more sound logic. Um, Here you can see types of developmental milestones such as centration, which is the focus on one aspect of an object, ignoring others. So it might be that a child would sort things by color and not really pay attention to their size or something like that. You also see egocentrism, which is the ability to take the perspective of others. So, would a child be able to realize that um, that I see something in a different way? If they're looking at a scene or they're looking at something from one direction and I'm looking at from another direction, do they assume that I'm seeing the same thing that they're seeing? Or do they realize that because I'm maybe sitting on the other side of the table, that I'm seeing something in a different way? And maybe I'm seeing things differently than they are. The third stage in his theories was concrete operational stage, which he saw from 7 to 12 years of age. And this is where children um, began to think about or understand logical operations. They're no longer fooled just by an appearance, and they can classify objects now instead of just fixating on one thing. They can classify objects by several different features. One of the kind of hallmarks in this is the idea of conservation, that if we even if we change the appearance of something, that it is still of equal size or number as long as nothing's been removed or added. Um, Kind of classic examples, a child who has not demonstrated this conservation yet would look at those marbles, and if you had those marbles where you had the same number, but some are closer together and another is spread out, and you asked which pile or which line had more marbles, they maybe would point then at the more spread out one because it looks bigger. um, and instead of realizing that they're both have, in this case, six marbles. Another kind of classic example is um, taking fluids and pouring them in a different shaped container that may be a more narrow container so that it's taller. Um, and can the child recognize, if you have demonstrated conservation, you would recognize that it's still the same volume, even though it's in a different size container? The final stage in Piaget's theories is the formal operational stage. And he saw this from 12 years to adulthood. And this is where people can think abstractly and they can formulate and test hypotheses through logic. Now, um, once again, it's important to recognize that Piaget's stages aren't perfect, and he really underestimated the ages at which certain skills can develop. Um, and also, they're not really talking about it in terms of stages is really kind of a poor way, because when you think of stage, you think you pass stage one, then you go to stage two, then you go to stage three. But really, these are kind of continuums, and that these are things that develop over time, and there might be aspects of one stage that are developing as another, but it's not just these very strict you must accomplish these milestones before you can then move on to the next stage. So they're better thought of as trends rather than as strict stages. The sociocultural theory of development was by Vygotsky. And basically, the way, and this came out of Russia, um, that humans, the way he saw it was that humans use these symbols and psychological tools to create culture. And culture is what then dictates what people need to learn and the skills that they need to develop. So basically, when as the child is growing, they're in this social world, and that forms the basis of the formation of their language and thought, and that their language and their thought is depends on the cultural background that they're surrounded by. He also had this format, or this theory, how you have knowledgeable individuals who provide scaffolding to guide younger generations socialization and culture, so that you can break things up into smaller pieces, and you can allow them to have early mastery of these things before you then introduce more complex, until eventually the child gains some mastery of this themselves. Language development is another area of study. There's generally kind of five stages that we see in language development. First, an infant will have cooing, these first verbal sounds that they will make, and then this will then turn into babbling, where there's these intentional vocalizations made that don't necessarily have a specific meaning. They're just intentional noises that are being made. Then we have first words. We have the one word stage, where real words are starting to be used by the baby. Then you start to see telegraphic speech. So toddlers will tend to speak using kind of rudimentary sentences that are missing words and have um, uh, grammatical mistakes, but they still follow a logical syntax, and you can still understand what they're trying to say, even if they're not using all the exact right words or not using all the exact correct grammar. And then you have, you can see, over regularization. And the young children will tend to incorrectly use a syntax rule when there should be an exception to the rule. And so you'll see this in like verb endings, is maybe a good example, where maybe a certain verb um, has an irregular form, but yet they use ed at the end of it. So instead of saying that they read something, that they read, well, I guess that's readed. Maybe they wouldn't say. You can get the idea that words that would have that would not have an ed at the end of it, or an ing or something like that, normally, then they might use those instead.